Deepak, let me ask you, now that you're in market, you've been exploring these technologies, how much of your options are multi-touch versus incrementality? Are you hearing some of these words for the first time? How much do you guys discuss these different techniques?
No, I've actually come across these terms. So we're starting off with only one multi-touch option. That's a linear multi-touch. Otherwise, it's just the first touch and last touch. The idea is to, I mean, at least the way we're approaching it, the way we're building it, first lock down the basics, because whatever I read online indicated is, I mean, that last touch is still very much prevalent, although I can't figure out why. So it's just these three models for now: first touch, last touch, and linear multi-touch. Though we do plan to expand to, I guess, time decay and probably the W-shaped one. I think it's also called the scientific one, scientific attribution modeling.
So you're focused on building out MTA module for your CDP, I guess. Okay, makes sense.
Yes,
Jamarius, how much
yes.
just with the agency world and in the time that you spent at Honeylove, how much you guys talk about, multi-touch versus incrementality testing versus MMMs?
Most of the time, it just depends on it depended on how mature the company's data was and kind of where they were at. A lot of companies were still stuck on last touch attribution. And so even though we wanted to move them to something more robust and things, we'd have to start with like, hey, maybe we'll start with just like multi-touch or even just showing, just mostly just showing them like multi-touch and showing them like, hey, let's give a piece of the pie here and a piece of the pie there, and doing it very like programmatically there, so they can kind of see how it works before we move into something that is, like you said earlier, a little bit more black box, a little bit more data sciencey and like harder to grasp concepts, such as like incrementality and like testing and things like that. And then the ultimate goal when I was agency side was to move them to some randomized control testing. So we could do cool stuff with them that way, but it usually always had to start with like MTA, because that's like the next step that they could grasp quickly and would trust us on.
It's a very common, so what Jamarius walked through is a very common path, especially for brands, because there's a lot of MTA literature out there, and partly because of how long it's been around. So a lot of people have been putting this stuff out there for many, many years. So when brands and marketers go and research, they're going to end up stumbling on a lot of MTA literature. So naturally, they're going to come in and say, there'll be more support for an MTA execution than, for example, incrementality execution. Naturally, and there's more. It's also more inaccessible. The science of incrementality and MMMs are a little bit more inaccessible compared to MTA right now. So naturally, you'll see that. Gail, what's your experience? What do you see in the brands that you worked at? How would you describe, I guess, maturity for brands from this standpoint?
So I really think, honestly, that at its heart, for the maturity piece of it, you assume that a brand that's healthy is going to be continuing to grow over time. And so you're not talking about necessarily a stasis type situation, where I think with your maturity for a lot of things outside of marketing, you're really talking about, okay, I want to get to this stasis level, with, say, forecasting or other types of analytics. You want to get to your point where you feel confident that what you're doing is replicable, and you just can kind of continue that forward. With marketing, what you're actually hoping is that you're always on the move. So what I consider maturity is not just kind of that dip in the water testing, but then that you're also constantly reevaluating those scale and saturation barriers. That was at SOP, the company I was at before. That's where we started to really feel like we were in touch with what was happening. Even as we were growing, maybe we were growing Facebook advertising 80% in spend year over year. But what was happening was we felt confident still of the maturity and our ability to flex with that because of what we were doing with the constant scale and saturation testing that was underlying that.
Yeah. How would you, in terms of, you worked before Soft, you were at some retail place, right?
Yep, so the party supply company. Yeah, and then with textbooks.com before that. So lots of various consumer goods before moving over to life sciences.
Okay, and so if you compare the textbooks company and the party supplies compared to soft surroundings felt like, the way you described it, feels like a more mature analytical execution.
100%. Yeah.
In those other companies you worked at.
So there was definitely things I could take from the previous one. So like, for example, textbooks is a very transactional online business, right? You come in, you literally, for most people, they're just quickly price shopping. They're going to hit maybe 1 to 2 touches in their cycle, and then they're going to buy, and then they're going to be out again, and you're not going to see them for months. Whereas something at Soft Surroundings, you had to consider a lot of the stuff with the full funnel, because you were doing a lot of this brand building, it was a very lifestyle oriented clothing company, so there was lots of really beautiful imagery and, lookbooks. Oh, here's this at, Turks and Caicos. Here's, this, we're in Sequoia National Park, all this really beautiful stuff that we knew had effect, but it's really hard to measure because this isn't necessarily a transactional, I'm going to look at an ad and I'm going to buy the next day kind of thing. There's this big gap in there. So the maturity model was very different there than it was at somewhere where you were very closely aligned with my advertising here induces this effect here. There was a lot more that you had to kind of take into account, including things like that offline, people going into stores, people getting the print catalogs, people getting, the coupon mailer, that kind of thing. So there was a lot of nuance that went into getting that model at the place where we needed it to be.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.